By now, most people know that one of Jordan Peterson's chief accomplishments has been his ability to reach young men in dire straits, who feel lost, who feel without purpose, and uplift them and move them forward in their lives. The vast majority of his audience remains, to this day, male, and his books, particularly 12 Rules, seem to resonate very strongly with men and young men in particular. And I recently found out that that book is the world's best-selling book, by his own account at least. And I've spent a good deal of time in recent weeks paying attention to Jordan Peterson, what he has to say, in greater depth and detail than I had hitherto done. And one of his recurrent themes and claims is that the greatest gift you can give a man is the gift of responsibility, and that young men in particular are starved for that feeling of responsibility. His argument, or so it goes, is that responsibility is the purpose of a man. Now, he never goes into the nitty-gritty details of the differences between being for men and women. Well, sometimes he does, but not in the right way, I think. And I'm going to break that down here before I proceed. What he means when he says that responsibility is the purpose of man is his way of saying that a man only can have extrinsic value. And a woman, by way of contrast, he never puts it this way, has intrinsic value. She has a womb, she can give birth to children. This all goes back to our reproductive limitations and the structures that we've imposed upon ourselves as a consequence of those reproductive limitations. A woman has intrinsic value, and a man either has no value if he does nothing and does not assume responsibility, or he has value because he is doing something. The famous man-woman myth line, it bears repeating constantly: women are human beings, men are human doings. And essentially that's what he means when he's saying that. He doesn't put it that way, and he might not even think of it in precisely that way, but that's basically what he means. And it certainly is true in the current year, these days, that young men feel a distinct lack of purpose, a lack of responsibility, nothing to work towards. Men tend to feel good about themselves inasmuch as they are providing utility to the external world. That is the purpose, as it were, of man, to be a utility to the external, rather to himself. A woman exists unto herself as a bearer of children. She doesn't need to do anything else, in theory at least, to have value. She can add value to that, but the fact that she has a womb and can give birth to children, well, that's enough. A man needs to go beyond that. Looking at the reproductive track record, we know that with some ups and downs, give or take, roughly twice as many women have reproduced as men. This tells us something. And this seems to be lacking, obviously, in the current atmosphere, in the current environment, etc., etc. So Jordan Peterson is rightly, I think, in some sense, addressing this issue. And he says something along the lines of, start with something, start small, clean your room. Or to speak with his high Albertan Canadian accent, which I can only so poorly imitate, clean your bloody room, man, just start someplace, right? Fair enough, these are not bad suggestions. Tie your shoelaces if they're not tied. Make your bed. Don't go out bench pressing 400 pounds if you can't do it. Start taking a walk if you don't exercise at all, or if you're overweight, or whatever. You get the drift. This is his line of argumentation, and it's not bad, and I support it. And the premise, or rather contained in the premise of Peterson's argument, is a secondary argument that if you are responsible, if you carry out your duty as a man, you will be duly and justly rewarded by a feeling of accomplishment and by a sense of achievement. That's true to a large extent, and it has been historically true. But one thing that I find perhaps not shocking, but surprising in Peterson's rhetoric, given his current state as a powerhouse celebrity. By now, everyone in the world knows who Jordan Peterson is. He's world famous. Everyone knows him. He's a multimillionaire, etc., etc. He has a lot to say, and many, many ears are willing to listen. And what he seems to routinely not mention is that in today's day and age, a man who assumes responsibility in the ways that he suggests can be unjustly and very unfairly punished. Which is to say, this is a very important issue. His entire argument is a version of man up. And I don't really have anything for or against man up. If that's your take on things, sure. But the reality remains that today, in our day and age, a man who mans up, who does the quote-unquote right thing, assumes responsibility, becomes a useful tool to the rest of society, is not necessarily going to be rewarded in an appropriate fashion. I think it would be hard to muster the argument that now for decades, in light of the marital system and divorce court system, that millions and millions of men all were awful, horrible hooligans and charlatans and deserved their fate. No, I think that's very unlikely statistically and otherwise. More likely has been the case that many of these men, for countless decades now, have been doing the right thing, manning up, being a useful tool to the rest of society in all the ways that Jordan Peterson suggests, and still being punished for it, on the whim of a fickle and somewhat whimsical woman, oftentimes. We all know that the stats, roughly 70% of all divorces are initiated by women, yada, yada, yada. Oftentimes, and this is the most commonly cited reason, so-called irreconcilable differences, or I'm simply not happy. This comes from women. Now, given that, I would think it very useful and important that Peterson should add, you can try to do the right thing, but it might not amount to anything. And in fact, in today's world, you might be punished for doing the right thing, and that's a horrible thing. He should say that, I think. And he mentioned, remember, we can recall his brief discussion of MGTOW, where he initially referred to MGTOW as a bunch of weasels, and then forwarded some half-ass apology in an interview or a discussion, and mentioned how he had seen men devastated by divorce. And we know the stats here, too. Suicide rates shoot up after divorce. Not to mention that some men actually go to debtor's prison, and they don't get to see their children, and we all know the deal by now. And it seems to me rather obvious that a guy like Peterson must know this too, and I don't know what game he's playing. This guy has so much reach now, so much fame and infamy in some circles, that he could be one of the first people to openly and publicly address the great lack of parity in the legal system when it comes to men and women regarding marriage, divorce, and children. He could do that. He could say, it's the best thing in the world for men to man up and to perform their duty and be useful to society and the world, because that's how they're going to get their value, but they're not being rewarded for that. In fact, it took Karen Strawn in a reply to Peterson when he initially called men who go their own way weasels, took her to explain that to him. I don't know if you ever watched that video by her, but it's possible that it's not always the case that you're rewarded, and that the system itself is a loaded gun, whether the woman in question has the intention or not. And I'm not saying don't get married, do whatever the hell you want with your life. I'm just saying that Peterson must know these things. He must know that the system is lopsided. He talks about the skewed ratio of boys to girls in school, and then later on young men and young women at level of university. So he must know that something is afoot in terms of the way our society is structured, whether he calls it gynocentric or female-oriented or feminine-oriented or whatever. He knows something is afoot, and yet, and this is the puzzling thing to me, he doesn't make any remark on this, none whatsoever, at least not directly to the point where he says, yes, you can do all of these things and you can feel you have a sense of purpose, but you may not be rewarded for it. Put it this way, I don't think there's anything wrong per se with getting married. It's not for me. I'm not going to say, don't do this. It's not my place. I'm a nobody. I'm insignificant. You do whatever you think is right with your life as a man. However, if somebody told you you should run into this jungle, and once you get out of the jungle, or when you're in the jungle, it's going to be an incredibly rewarding experience. But this person doesn't tell you about the dangerous fauna, that inhabits the jungle. He doesn't tell you about the dangerous, poisonous flora that inhabits the jungle. He doesn't tell you that, in this particular case, there had been a war fought in the jungle, and that there are hidden landmines in various spots, and that you could easily trip over one and have your upper body severed from your lower body, or die outright. He doesn't tell you that it's extremely treacherous, and you may not make it to the end, and you may not make it to the wide open plains once you enter the jungle. He just says, go into the jungle, that's your purpose, assume all the responsibility. This is a problem, to my mind. I think men need to be informed of this. Now, I've heard, strangely enough, in recent times, counter-arguments to this. I've been told rather directly that even mentioning the risks of the current system is somehow inimical and hostile to the institution of marriage, because I am, by saying such things, discouraging men from taking the plunge. The analogy offered to me at the time, I believe, was, and I think this is not an analogy, I think it's a disanalogy, was that if everyone knew the dangers of climbing Mount Everest, no one would do it. Well, of course, the people who climb Mount Everest are aware of the dangers. It's a very, very dangerous mountain to climb. It's the tallest mountain, at least on land, in the world. People have died. There are still corpses, or the bones, of people who have died somewhere near the summit on the way up to Mount Everest. We know these things. It's not a good analogy. So the idea that empowering people with information and knowledge discourages them from things, well, that's partially true. If you know something is dangerous, and in some cases exceptionally dangerous, you might be hesitant to pursue it, or you might choose a different path. The idea that we should not provide men, in particular young men, with information and knowledge about themselves, about their own nature, about female nature, and about the broader legal implications of a system that not uniformly but somewhat systematically favors women as opposed to men, seems to me absolutely foolish, because what you're going to end up with is even more broken men, and men who are even more broken after the fact, after they've engaged in this great struggle and this great kampf against the system than they had been prior. And that doesn't make any sense to me. And for those men who are aware of these things and still entertain the risks, more power to them. They want to do that. But the idea that men should pursue these dreams blindly, uninformed, to me seems the absolute epitome of folly. It's fine if you want to go after these things. It's fine if you wish to become valuable to the world, whatever. I don't have a problem with that. If that's what gets your rocks off, by all means. But just know a few things. Your value is completely dependent on your utility to the world. Inasmuch as you don't provide value, you will cease to have utility. You will be a zero. You will be a nothing. You will be more or less the bum on the street, save for the fact that you might have a roof over your head, at least for the time being. These are things that Peterson and others should tell you as a man, particularly as a young man, because the idea that he is the perfect mentor and is giving men perfect advice, well, he's pointing men in a good direction. It's not entirely the correct direction because the instructions lack that vital information, to my mind. He needs to add things onto this. And inasmuch as he chooses to do so at a later date, I encourage him. He has such wide reach, such fame, such renown right now, that he is possibly the best person to do this job. He's possibly the person in the best position to distribute this information and make young men and men in general aware of these things. And ultimately, I don't know if Jordan Peterson is intentionally hiding these things from men and young men in particular, but I think, for all his talk of responsibility, he has a responsibility to men, inasmuch as he dispenses advice to men on what they should do with their lives, to also inform these men of the great risks and the structures that act as impediments to their progress in their quest to assume responsibility and gain purpose and be useful to the world. And that's pretty much all I have to say on the matter. I didn't want to make this video too long, but it is an important issue that needs to be addressed. And Peterson, like I said, given his platform, given his reach, given his vast popularity, is probably the best person alive today who is addressing men's issues in part to talk about some of these other issues that he seems to refuse to want to talk about. And I don't know the reason for that. I'm only left to speculate. But it is important to point these things out. I think information is important. Even if it discourages some people, other people will go ahead nonetheless. But it is better to enter the jungle armed with the knowledge of the animals, the plant life, the mines on the ground, the vines, the thorns, etc., than just to jump into the jungle and hope for the best. With that said, I will bring this video to a close. Thanks for tuning in, and with luck, I will check you out at a later date. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.